Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tools and beyond the headlines. Last month, Cuba saw an unprecedented wave of protests across the country, scenes not seen on the island since the revolution over 60 years ago. Food shortages and COVID no doubt have something to do with it, but what does it say about Cuba more broadly? Cuba has made some serious currency reforms this past year, and people are watching closely to see how the government in Havana and to some extent, Washington handle it. To discuss all of this, I'm delighted to have with us our very own Cuba expert. He's Dr. Michael Bustamante. Michael is the Associate Professor of History at the University of Miami and leads our study tours to Cuba. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Nicholas. Good to see you.
Great to have you with us. I'm just going to congratulate you on your new post, which you've just joined. You've just left your previous university, and you're on the way to the new one. So well done on that front. I want to just get just a brief update, just to give us an idea of what's been happening more recently on the streets, but just also to give us an idea of how widespread were those protests and what form did they take.
Sure. Well, on July 11th, so, come 3 weeks ago or so, all of a sudden I was on social media and I saw people sort of frenetically posting a link to somebody sort of live streaming via Facebook Live something happening in a place called San Antonio de los Baños. San Antonio de los Baños is a small town in Cuba outside of Havana. Few foreigners go there, and what became apparent when I clicked on the live stream was that this was a live stream of a pretty significant street protest of hundreds of people first gathered in that city's kind of central town square, if you will, and then proceeding to kind of march through a number of thoroughfares of the city. Protesters were chanting a variety of things. From "we want medicine" to "we want food" to epithets toward the current Cuban head of state, to the word freedom, to I think perhaps most moving in a way, they were chanting "we are not afraid." And what happened thereafter was that basically the live stream got picked up. And soon that protest was kind of duplicated in upwards of 30 to 40 towns and cities across the island, running the gamut from far western Cuba all the way to the eastern side of the island. And this is simply, unprecedented. The last time any kind of significant street protest happened, you'd have to go back to 1994. At that time, Cuba was in the throes of its economic crisis following the collapse of the Soviet Union and all that meant for the Cuban economy. There were isolated street protests in Havana. Actually, today is the anniversary, as it turns out, of those street protests from 1994, but they lasted a day and fizzled out, fairly quickly. And maybe, as some of your guests will remember, one of the things that it led to was the government's decision to open the borders, or the island's borders, such as they are, and to let people leave, and that led to this migration crisis of Cuban rafters in 1994. But again, in terms of protests, it was only in the capital. And what was so significant about what happened on July 11th was that it didn't start in Cuba's capital and it didn't end there. They did reach Cuba's capital. And so, I think ever since then, folks have been parsing, what these protests mean, where they come from. There are multiple causes. I could say something about that.
Yeah. We're going to talk about all that in a moment, but just to get a measure of how serious the government was concerned, just give us some of their reactions and what they've done in the last few weeks since.
Yeah, I think at first it seemed like all of us, in a way, outside of Cuba and maybe many inside of Cuba, it seemed like the government was caught flat-footed, caught by surprise. I think if you zoom out, it's hard to predict that this would happen exactly when it did, but the conditions perhaps were there. But the government took a while to respond that day, and then what happened was somewhere kind of early to mid-afternoon. I don't exactly remember the time. The head of state, Miguel Diaz-Canel, went on national television after having himself gone to this place, San Antonio de los Baños, the site of the protest, to try to in theory, talk down the protesters. This was something out of Fidel Castro's playbook. That's what Fidel did in 1994. But after that, he went on national television. He gave a very aggressive kind of speech in which he called on government supporters to go to the streets and combat, was the word that he used, these expressions of dissent. That word was taken by many to be a kind of incitation to violence. There was violence that transpired that day. Accounts are mixed as to sort of who struck first in many cases, but it is clear that the state's response was repressive. And in the last few weeks, tallies are a bit sketchy, but anywhere from between 400 to 700 people have been arrested, and some have been released under house arrest. Some have been charged in kind of what are being called summary trials. So it's very interesting, because after that first sort of aggressive speech, the next day the government's tone changed, and it was all sort of, we need love, we need dialogue, but at the same time they're clearly making examples out of some of the people that participated in the protest,
and
while
troops
also sort of
troops on the street as well. Troops actually,
a pretty unprecedented mobilization of not only sort of uniformed police and the Boinas Negras, which are kind of like a special forces sort of unit, but deputizing citizens, state security agents who were dressed as civilians, literally on the streets with bats. It's worth noting there were some acts of vandalism that were part of these protests. Unclear if they followed sort of the police coming out to the streets. The targets of that vandalism had some significance, and I can go into that, but they were not. These were overwhelmingly peaceful from every kind of evidence that we've seen.
Okay, what I want to do is step back a bit and not draw any immediate conclusions if we can, because I think there's a lot to explore. One thing I was going to say was presumably social media, the fact that people who've got mobile phones, as you indicated, live streaming on Facebook, that could have happened in '94,
exactly.
The government shut down the internet, but then realized that it needed the internet itself, so it put it back online. So
it's been like a whack-a-mole sort of thing with the internet. Social media is key here. Worth noting, Cubans did not have internet on their phones until early 2019. So this is a fairly recent thing. This would have been impossible even 5 years ago.
Wow.
In terms of social media being the vehicle through which news of this, kind of spread.
Yeah. So, and I guess in the back of the government's mind, do you be really repressive, and what's going to be the reaction to that? Let's get into a bit more sort of background, if you like. I think it's really important for people to understand some real basics. How do Cubans get, the protests were about food, were about medicine. In normal circumstances, let's just presume that things aren't as bad as they are at the moment. How would Cubans expect to get their food? This is a country that's potentially very wealthy in terms of agriculture. Where do they normally get their incomes from? Just give us an overview of how ordinary Cubans manage to survive from day to day.
Sure. Let me first just say, these protests were not just about food and medicine. I think that's important.
Yeah.
The economic and the political here were very much imbricated, and I'll say more about that. Cuba's economy has, never quite been the same since the fall of the Soviet Union. Over the last 30 years, they came out of that low point, if you will, in the mid 90s through a number of means. Perhaps most prominently, they opened up to global tourism in a way that they hadn't before. So tourism is one sort of really important anchor of the economy. And to the extent that people, and including a sort of nascent private sector that's been developing in Cuba, especially over the last 10 years, to the extent that folks have their kind of a foot in the tourist economy and therefore access to certain forms of hard currency, they have been able to carve out, livings for themselves. And the tourist economy has all kinds of sort of, multiplier effects in all other areas. So that's one. You mentioned agriculture. Cuba is a country that today imports something like 70% of the food that its people eat, which is nuts, right? We're not talking about the island of Barbados. We're talking about the largest island in the Caribbean. The land area of Cuba is about the same as the land area of England. Just to put it in perspective, this is not some dinky island in the Caribbean. If England is not part of a dinky island, north of Europe. So there is tremendous agricultural capacity. The agricultural industry has been plagued by sort of centralized state control, an epidemic of a kind of a weed that grows that they've been trying to get rid of. And they've been trying to sort of reform the agricultural economy for 10 years. They've been giving more land over to private agricultural growers in usufruct, that is sort of long-term leases, but the results have not been there. And so this has been really damaging in the context of the present economic crisis, which has been aggravated by COVID and all kinds of other things, because Cuba is short on hard currency and it can't import the food that it used to. And so food is in short supply. That's one area of the economy that's important. The export of professional services is another major sort of income earner for the Cuban economy. Cuba is well known for sending doctors abroad. It's both a humanitarian and a monetary thing. That business, so to speak, has gone through ups and downs. And the last thing I would mention is sort of a major plank of the Cuban economy is, two, I would say, and this is relevant in the context of COVID. Since the 1980s, Cuba has developed its own biotech industry. And over the last year, they've been developing their own COVID vaccines. I can say more about that. They're rolling them out now. If those are successful, and the tests suggest that they are, there is a potential economic upside there. They're selling them to Iran, for example. And then last, I would say, is remittances, right? The Cuban diaspora in the United States and around the world plays a huge role in the economy. Depending on the year, depending on US regulations on the amount of money that people can send to the island, those numbers go up and down. But at the high point a few years ago, I mean, Cubans abroad were sending something like $3 billion a year in cash. And that doesn't even include the literal stuff that Cubans who visit home bring in their suitcases, and a whole kind of transnational, market and black market of items that are then brought into the country in suitcases and then resold. So those are the major planks of the economy, but life is difficult. There were better years over the last 20 years. And others, the last 4 years have been increasingly difficult for a series of reasons. The implosion of close ally Venezuela, Trump administration sanctions that were highly intensified, the slowness of the government's efforts to follow through on its own economic reform, now having moved forward with a currency reform at pretty much the worst moment that you could do it, since everything else is going so bad in the economy. And then COVID, for an island that is so reliant on tourism, not having tourists for 18 months is, with some exceptions, it's just been a real wallop. I mean,
you summed up some of the key things that's taking place now. Just anecdotally, I mean, I do remember very well when we've traveled with you, visiting the food distribution centers, seeing people being given eggs, and there's still families who depend upon that. Knowing that the average family on average income is $23 a month. In terms of world market scales, how much food is $23 going to buy you? It just doesn't.
Right. That number has changed a bit, because when the government has done a couple of salary reforms over the last 2 years in which they've upped those average earnings, in part to try to compensate for some of the inflationary effects of this devaluation that they just did. Yeah. It's another conversation, but suffice it to say, what the average income is still far below what what people need for on a daily basis, and then, so they have to figure out a way around
alongside
it.
That, the thing that really comes home to us is that when you talk, obviously tourism is one thing, but when we've met with you, people who are starting up different professions, people who are trading, that whole sense of a private economy, but taking place within very restrictive regulatory circumstances. And I know that
I mean, again, though, there have been some the government has been telegraphing since July of last year some important changes in that respect. At the depth of the pandemic, in terms of its effects on the economy, the government came out and said, we're going to expand the private sector as we never have before. We're going to give legal status to small businesses. That is sort of like limited liability status. You could now, or soon, apparently, you're going to be able to operate a small business not out of your personal bank account, but out of like a business bank account. They've talked at the currency reform. So they are moving the ball on some economic reform things that are potentially very significant, which they've been delaying following through on for 10 plus years. The question is whether they're doing it quickly enough. And these are processes that also have winners and losers. And what's interesting about these protests is that, to the extent that Cuba has undergone economic liberalization at all over the last 5-6 years, there are winners and there are losers, and a lot of the people on the streets were the losers of that process. That is, those who haven't been able to benefit or plug themselves into the tourist or private economy, because you live in a place like San Antonio de los Baños where there are no tourists who show up, right? So it's a very difficult, I think, objectively needle to thread for the government on the economic front.
Okay. Let's. I mean, it's obvious, I guess, to everyone that with COVID, you're going to see a contraction of the economy everywhere. Tourism, a country that's so dependent on tourism, that's a key thing. I saw that they had 1 million tourists last year. That's 2020 compared to 4.2 million in 2019. So that's a big drop. So the difficult economic circumstances to start with. Why do a currency reform now? But before we get to that question, just explain us about the Cuban currency, because it's incredibly complicated and it's led to part of the mess. So just explain that first of all. That's not an easy question to answer.
I'll try to do it in a minute or less to not bog down in the details. But rewind to the 1990s again, right? When the Soviet Union falls, Cuba's currency, the peso, de facto loses a lot of value, even though the state is trying to sort of prop it up and keep it up at the value that it was. The US dollar starts to circulate in the black market. And therefore, in the black market, the exchange rate between the Cuban peso and the US dollar becomes devalued, or the peso is devalued compared to the US dollar. So at a certain point, the government, what they do to try to stave off a further surge in prices in the state sector of the economy, that sector that people buy stuff through subsidized rationing program, things like that, they legalize a kind of a parallel set of stores that are run by the government that sell quote unquote luxury goods in US dollars. So they legalize the holding of US dollars, and they operate this dual currency thing between dollars and Cuban pesos. And the idea is that with the earnings of the hard currency from people who are comparatively well off, because let's say they're getting remittances from their family abroad, they can then sort of support the state peso part of the economy in a way that worked to sort of stave off.
So you got sorry, go on. The way that worked.
No, I'm just in a way that worked to stave off what would have been sort of even worse in inflation in the context of the Soviet crisis. But it created all kinds of distortions, because really the issue for Cuba's economy for so long has not been just that there are two currencies. It has been that there are multiple exchange rates. So on the street, for the longest time, basically the rate was, and by the street, I don't mean black market. I mean, officially for average citizens, 24 Cuban pesos was worth $1. At a certain point, they got rid of the dollar. They created this thing called the Cuban convertible peso, which is kind of like monopoly money because no one recognizes it abroad, but it functions like a dollar, same purpose. So 1 to 24, right? But for a state sector business, their exchange rate was 1 to 1. As if 1 Cuban peso was worth basically $1 US, which is just no reflection of reality. And it created real distortions in the economy, because if you overvalue the exchange rate in the state sector, all of a sudden you're making imports look a lot cheaper to the state sector business. And so Cuba's economy became highly reliant on imports. It didn't generate exports, right? And that's what the economy needs. So that's just one example of the kind of distortions that are involved. So they've been talking about needing to not just unify the currencies, but unify the exchange rates for a really long time. This has been something that the Raul Castro government put on the table, that this needs to happen, et cetera, et cetera. And they kept kind of putting it off, I think, with the idea that they wanted to do other economic reforms first to sort of get the economy to a stronger place, because this was going to be painful, right? Because if you all of a sudden devalue things for the state sector businesses, some of those state sector businesses are going to go bust, right? Because their books have been totally just no reflection of reality. And what ended up happening was that Raul Castro retired. He passed this hot potato to Miguel Díaz-Canel, and hindsight is 2020, I suppose, but they waited too long. I mean, it's clear, because then the Obama boom years ended of more U.S. travelers bringing hard currency in. Trump came in, hard sanctions, Venezuela's economy imploded, COVID happened, and now they were forced to try to move forward with this, because it is necessary. It's unquestionably necessary to try to boost the boost exports, diminish the reliance on imports. They have called it tarea ordenamiento, so the ordering work of the currency system. But make no mistake,
basically they've run out of foreign reserves, haven't they? They've just run out of dollars at all, and they need to stop that leakage, as it were.
Right. But let me say, so what they did starting January 1st of 2021, they said everything's going to go to 1 to 24, basically. So state sector is going to have the same exchange rate as the street. That is still probably an overvalued rate, right, respective to what economists think the exchange rate should be. And that's reflected by what the exchange rate is in the street, which has fluctuated. And by here, when I say street, I mean black market, right? That has fluctuated more between, say $1 to 50 pesos or something like that. So a further devaluation may well have to happen in the future. But the other thing that's really kind of muddled the picture here is that because of that shortage of hard currency, right, the government started doing something else in late 2019, which in a way works against, or it was in early 2020, I forget, but it works against the goal of currency unification. They created new set of stores that now don't accept the CUC, which was that dollar kind of substitute, and they only accept what they call moneda libremente convertible, that is foreign currency, but foreign currency that can only be paid digitally. That is, you have to have somebody abroad send you 50 euro or 50 bucks or whatever, and they kind of deposit it on this like credit card kind of thing. And then you go to these stores, and in theory, this was to basically capture hard currency that before was being spent and circulated in this black market circular economy of people who would leave Cuba, buy stuff abroad, import it in their suitcases, and resell it. So effectively, you now have, you still have multiple currencies, is the point. You now have even more exchange rates than before, because if the state rate and the public rate are now the same officially, the black market situation is nuts. You've got one rate for dollars to euros, you've got rates for pesos to dollars, you've got rates for peso to these MLC credits. It's a very complicated picture, to put it mildly. And so I don't yet see light at the end of the tunnel. And importantly, and this is the last thing I'll say on currency reform, unless you want to hear more, all the economists seem to agree that not only was the timing of when they did it complicated, but it was as if, the sequencing of it vis-a-vis other economic reforms was off, right? If you're going to do this and there's going to be short-term pain, the benefit of a devaluation is that the economy has to have the capacity to respond to, in theory, the incentives that a devaluation creates. And yet, by not yet having legalized or expanded space in the private sector, you have not created the ability for the economy to respond to what the devaluation is doing, right? They say that's coming, but the Cuban economists at the University of Havana, working in public institutions, are saying this sequencing was backwards. You should have set up the other thing first, right? Got that architecture in place, and then, hit go on currency reform, because then at least the economy has a way to respond. So
I'm not an economist, but I know that what we've been talking about for the last 5 minutes or so is really, really important in terms of understanding things. The parallel is Venezuela, which devalued its currency. Was it 2013, I think? And
I think they've devalued it multiple times.
Yeah. But the consequent inflation has been catastrophic. And I think Cuban government economists was themselves saying that this is equivalent roughly to an 80% or sixfold devaluation. And that means prices have to increase between 500 to 900% now, that is.
Right. And that's where the government did come in and decree everyone's salaries is going up by I forget what percent, but it hasn't been enough to compensate for those pricing increases.
Yeah. So you're seeing rapid inflation. And at the same time as a huge contraction of the economy due to COVID. So it's the worst of all scenarios.
Yeah, and circling back to the protests, if I can, clearly the effects of the currency reform, people's perception that it isn't making their life better but making it worse. This whole new thing with these hard currency stores that a lot of people don't have access to. It's no mistake that if there were acts of vandalism that were committed in the protest, one of the kinds of establishments that were targeted were these hard currency stores, right, as indicative of a currency policy, a monetary policy that has really hit people's pockets, right? So to the extent that economics is driving part of the urgency of this protest movement on July 11th, the currency thing is definitely something that is on people's minds.
Okay. We're going to start taking questions soon. Please do put your questions in the Q&A box wherever it is on your screen, and then Dave can promote you, and then we can put those questions directly to Mike. I mean, you've spoken about this before. This of the who's to blame, and clearly we've been focusing on Cuban government policy. At the same time, there are U.S. sanctions, and they have hardened substantially, and they hardened substantially under Trump, but they haven't changed since Biden has come through. And I think we need to explore that a bit. But just to say, just remind us what Trump has done, what Trump did in terms of sanctions, and then perhaps we can explore a bit about what Biden's doing and what he hasn't been doing.
Sure. You all will remember, I mean, before Trump, just referencing Obama really quickly, Obama in 2014, I mean, really starting in 2009, but particularly after 2014, he, turned US policy on its head in many respects and said, rather than, try to isolate the Cuban economy, we're going to try to open up to it. Obama could only do so much because the embargo is controlled by Congress, but he could poke a lot of holes in the embargo. So travel to Cuba became easier. Limits on the amount of remittances that Cubans in the United States could send to their families were taken away. There was just, these were relative boom years for Cuba because all the folks from your side of the pond, as it were, decided to rush to Cuba too, to get there before we gringos would mess the place up, quote unquote. So it was, tourist boom years, all the rest of it. Trump comes in and says, and that's not even mentioning, diplomatic normalization, talks between both governments, agreements that were signed, et cetera, et cetera. Trump comes in, and really for domestic electoral reasons in South Florida more than anything else, this is not a guy who cares about Cuban policy at all. He says, I'm going to undo Obama's deal. I mean, he wanted to undo everything that Obama did because it was Obama. And so he, it was interesting because at first it was more rhetoric than it was substance. But by 2019, 2020, the Trump administration had embarked on what it called the maximum pressure campaign vis-a-vis both Cuba and Venezuela, really ramping up sanctions, cutting off a lot of that travel, putting in new restrictions on remittances, activating something called Title III of the Helms-Burton legislation from 1996, which, suffice it to say, throws cold water on the foreign investment and climate in the island.
Basically, so if you're a foreign company doing business of Cuba, you get hit by U.S. sanctions as well.
Well, you run that risk if you are deemed to be quote unquote trafficking in property that was nationalized by the Cuban government in the early 1960s. So there was a number of things. And these did have clear effects on the Cuban economy. I mean, to deny that is to be the ostrich with our head in the sand, right? You tell Cubans in the United States that they can no longer send as much money as they want to their family, and they have to send only $1,000 a quarter. On the one hand, that's not the strictest limit that's ever been put in place, but on the other hand, it restricts the amount of remittances that are coming into the country, right? That affects hard currency reserves. You'd stop travel, that hits this private sector that had really started to grow on the backs of increased U.S. visitors, among others, et cetera, et cetera. And it's worth noting that U.S. sanctions are not just bilateral; they have international ripple effects. I mean, any time the Cuban government or a Cuban government entity tries to do, a deal of one kind or another through international banking institutions that have any kind of loose connection through a conglomerate or something with the U.S. financial system, the Treasury Department can slap sanctions on that bank. And so banks internationally in Europe, around the world, don't want to touch any deal that has to do with Cuba. And so this does make their life economically difficult. Now, that said, if U.S. sanctions are a part of the picture of what has made the Cuban economy take a turn for the worse over the last few years, we also have to acknowledge that the Cuban government has been very slow to implement the very reforms and sort of ginger market reforms that they themselves have said that are on the table, right? They've been talking about updating the Cuban social and economic model for 10 plus years. right? And Cubans are tired, right? The Cuban government itself has recognized that of, I forget the number, 200 something, policy directives that they themselves at some point said, these are the things we're going to do in the economy. By the end of that 10 years, only, not a majority of those had even been implemented, right? And so there's a slow bureaucracy, the private sector expansion that's happened, there's been ups and downs. We're going to let it open. It's still restricted. Then we're going to clamp down on it again. Now we're opening again. And so there's this yo-yo effect, you're going to do it or you're not going to do it. So the Cuban government certainly bears responsibility. Absolutely. COVID is the wild card here that no one could have predicted. So I don't fault the Cuban government for the effect that has had on the Cuban economy. Cuba did very well controlling the spread of the disease during almost all of 2020, but they got to a point where they needed to open up to some tourists again, and including to some Cuban American visitors, and that led case numbers to rise. And since then, things have gotten really bad. So, it's been frustrating, frankly, because some of the discourse in the wake of these protests, the Cuban government has said, it's the blockade, it's the blockade, it's the blockade, it's the blockade, right? And these protests are part of a subversion strategy of a deliberate U.S. attempt to create a pressure cooker that will explode, right? And frankly, some calls for things as extreme as military intervention coming out of Miami.
You were talking about Bob Suarez in Miami.
Right, they don't help. They feed that Cuban government narrative. On the other side, you have folks in the United States and in the Cuban American community who are saying, this isn't about the embargo. This isn't about the embargo. The protests were demanding liberty, not down with the embargo. That's fine, but they also weren't demanding more U.S. sanctions either, right? This is not an either or. People in Cuba understand the impact that the embargo has on their life. They understand the impact that their own government's policies have on their life. And the smartest voices in Cuban society, I know, don't see this as an either or. They want U.S. policy to change, which they find offensive insofar as it tries to aggravate their suffering. And they want their government to change, period. And one is not conditional on the other. So, that's I think, an important.
Let's come back in a second to US policy in a moment. I want to take a quick question from Diane Cook. Please, everybody else, do add your questions in the Q&A box, and so we can put you. We don't know you've got a question until you put your question in the Q&A box, and then we can promote you as a panelist. Go ahead, Diane. Go on.
Yeah, it was when you were talking about the currency and the complexity. El Salvador reportedly is going to make Bitcoin legal tender. Now, I'm completely ignorant about cryptocurrencies. I must say my knowledge base there is zilch. But my question really is, do cryptocurrencies offer anything to Cuba?
It's a really interesting question. I confess being a Luddite when it comes to cryptocurrency myself. I know there are detractors and supporters. I know that there are conversations going on both within the Cuban government and outside as to how Cubans can leverage cryptocurrency as a way to, frankly, get around U.S. sanctions. I know that informally there is a small but existing cryptocurrency market in Cuba. It's one way that you can send remittances, right? If somebody on the island has a kind of cryptocurrency wallet, you can send them currency. And there are, in the informal market, in the black market, there are people who will do an exchange, who will allow you to convert your cryptocurrency credit, as it were, into the currency that Cubans need on the streets to buy stuff. Because unlike in El Salvador, my understanding, where they're trying to make cryptocurrency legal tender, right, to that you can spend in the stores and this and that, Cuba isn't there yet. So if you have access to cryptocurrency, you need to convert it somehow to a currency that you can actually use on the street, right? And so that's happening in the informal market. So I think that's a space to watch. I think it's also a space that the U.S. government and regulatory authorities are also more and more interested in watching and trying to regulate for lots of reasons, because it can get around sanctions regimes, and it can get around criminal justice regimes as well. So yeah, I think the what I would say is that the one impediment there is technological infrastructure in Cuba. Internet access has improved. People have internet on their phones. But still, the ease with which one can navigate some of those tools, I think, is an open question for me. But some, young, savvy Cubans are doing it.
Mike, you've spoken before about the impact of the Obama government administration and encouraging certainly civil society in Cuba to open up, and arguably there was an impact upon the economy as well. Biden, when he ran his campaign, said he would reintroduce some of those contacts with Cuba, but hasn't. How has Biden got himself sort of stuck in a corner?
Yeah, he is indeed stuck in a corner. A couple of reasons. Biden was never going to be Obama 2.0. I mean, I think we should just be clear about that. Any president coming in wants to put their own mark on it. It's not just going to say, "Hey, I'm going to go back to what the other guy did."
Yeah.
The regional environment had changed in many ways. You had a significant shift to the right in Latin America, although now it seems to be swinging back left. That you didn't have the region pushing the United States to normalize ties with Cuba in the way you had under Obama. So Biden was never going to be Obama 2.0, but he did say that he was going to get rid of some of the more noxious Trump administration sanctions that hurt, as he said, and I agree with him, civilians more than they hurt the government. What happened was the election result of 2020. And in 2020 in South Florida, Democrats did piss poor. There's no way around it, right? They did piss poor with Cuban voters. They did piss poor with Latino and Hispanic voters in general. They did worse with non-Cuban Hispanic voters, by the way. Big swing towards Trump. But Cuban voters as well. And what unfortunately, from my point of view, has happened is that the Democratic Party and political operatives in the Democratic Party, including in South Florida, have taken away a very cheap, superficial reading from those results, which is, oh my God, this was a referendum on Obama's Cuba policy. We got slammed for quote unquote appeasing the Cuban government. That is such a simplistic and impoverished reading of the dynamic that it's not even funny, because what really explains the Biden campaign's failure in South Florida is that they had literally no campaign here, right? Their effort to reach out to Hispanic and Latino voters was late, and it stunk.
I remember talking to you. I think we did 2 discussions on Florida.
Yeah. It stunk, and of course, the Republicans were trying to tag any Democrat, including a pretty centrist, moderate guy like Biden, as socialist, this and that. So in that respect, the Cuba specter comes in. But you do have a radicalization of an important part of the Cuban diaspora. The very part of it, the younger cohorts, more recently arrived cohorts of that diaspora, who had been the ones to take most advantage of the Obama era opening in terms of going back and forth and even investing under the table. But they got frustrated with the slow pace of change in Cuba. And they became, they fell under the Trump spell. Right. And so then it's no, we need to clamp down on them. So I think, the Biden people, since they came in, they've been walking on eggshells around Cuba. They came in saying it's not a priority. It's not a priority. I get that. They inherited a world of problems. Foreign policy to Latin America was never going to be their priority. But, their slowness to act has now put them in a bind. And that the bind in part is that because they haven't acted. And because now the Cuban government can tag them as having basically made the Trump policy their own, the Cuban government is throwing blame at Biden, saying Biden is Trump 2.0. And his administration is taking advantage of this desperate COVID situation that we have to exact humanitarian suffering and try to provoke unrest. And I think we'd be in a much different situation if Biden had begun to unwind some of those sanctions, but you still get these protests. More difficult to blame them on the United States, I think. So he's in a corner, and he's also in a corner, it must be said. There are people in his administration who were very close to the Obama policy, who were architects of it, right? But guess what? The Democratic majority in the Senate is razor thin, and there's a guy who's really important, Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who's Cuban American, who's not a fan of opening to Cuba, and he has got the Biden administration. What's a nice way of saying it? They are in a bind because they need every vote in the Senate, and this guy will make their life difficult, even though he's in the same party. I think the Biden administration has been walking too much around eggshells. I don't think someone like Bob Menendez is not going to support a massive infrastructure bill over Cuba policy. But
there is this hope among the Cuban American right, at least, is that These protests are evidence of a failing regime, and it's got to be said that the government is in one of the most difficult financial periods it has since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So things over the next few months are going to be very, very tough, next years or so.
They are. What I would say too is that a couple things. The argument now, I mean, if the politics around Biden moving on Cuba policy were difficult before this, they just got way worse. Right, or way more complicated, because now also you have the Cuban government responding to these protests through repression, and that now, for Biden to do anything on Cuba policy, he opens himself to the accusation that he is rewarding the repression, even though I think that that's a false way of seeing it. I don't think it's that simple. We are now very much, in my estimation, in a situation like we were in the 1990s. The Cuban economy is imploding, right? Demands for political change, et cetera. And at that, we need to learn the lesson that we didn't learn that. The lesson is that the United States then said, now's the time to double down on sanctions. Let's squeeze them till they're dry. And we'll get this Big Bang moment, a Berlin Wall moment in Cuba. It didn't happen then. I'm not necessarily, I don't know whether it will happen now, but I don't think there's a guarantee. And I think if it is going to happen, it's not because of U.S. policy. It's going to happen because of the Cuban people. The United States, to the extent that the United States is the internal boogeyman in Cuba's internal politics, it allows the Cuban government to exteriorize the blame for what's happening. So even from a realpolitik point of view, you would think that this is the moment for the United States to go in and say, hey, we are not the enemy here, right? You guys are having a really difficult moment with COVID. Here's a ton of vaccines. Here's a ton of supplies. We're going to offer it. Dare the Cuban government to say no, and they're not doing that. They're not doing that. And so it's ethically, morally, really difficult. And it must be said that, Cuba right now is is going through a really bad period in terms of the disease. Right, the healthcare system was such an achievement for Cuba's socialist welfare state is on the ropes. I ethically cannot condone a policy where the United States does nothing, it offers no help. Screw the politics, right? A friend of mine wrote me from Cuba, or a friend of mine wrote me saying that 4 of her friends in Cuba had died in the last week. Right, that's unacceptable. And it's not the United States' responsibility to solve that, but we can do a lot, and we're doing nothing. And so I'm very disappointed with the Biden administration's response.
Now, if we use Venezuela as that parallel, clearly sanctions haven't worked there. But the difference with Venezuela is that people can go and cross borders, and is it 5 million refugees have left Venezuela and mainly gone to Colombia? That is not so easy from Cuba, and where does that go?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's not so easy, and the dynamic there has changed because the last thing that the Obama administration did with Cuba before it walked out the door, literally in the last week, they got rid of this thing called the wet foot, dry foot policy that basically gave Cuban migrants or would-be Cuban migrants into the United States who showed up at U.S. ports of entry or on U.S. shores a guaranteed path to legal status. That's over. Right. So to the extent that Cubans kind of always had this last resort, that yes, it could be difficult to get to the United States by sea or traveling elsewhere in Latin America and then working your way to the U.S.-Mexico border, but you had a guaranteed way in, and that was always like the last resort for people. That's over, right? That's over. So I think to the extent that there was that safety valve or pressure valve, that's gone, and so that means that the Cuban government can't. As it did in 1994, said, okay, if you're unhappy, leave, and sort of, dump the problem on the United States or other countries. So they're going to have to act. The results here are going to get them out of this crisis, not slogans.
Okay. Let's take some more questions. Nigel Harley first. Go ahead, Nigel.
Yes, obviously in recent years, there's the relationship with Venezuela has been extremely important for Cuba, but also its relationships with other left-leaning Latin American countries and also elsewhere. Of course, critically looking at Russia and China in that context. I'm wondering what Michael thinks about the immediate short and long-term prospects for Cuba's external relationships, and particularly that relationship with both China and Russia.
Sure, great question. Thanks, Nigel. Both the relationships with Russia and China are warm, in terms of protocol and all the rest of it. What hasn't quite followed is neither country has seemed willing to really replace Venezuela as sort of the economic kingmaker for Cuba's economy. Yes, the Chinese have invested some. Yes, there are Russian investment projects. There are more Russian tourists now in Cuba than ever in recent years. But you don't get the sense that the Chinese, for example, are willing to kind of back an economic project that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. They want to make their money, right? So I don't see, at the level of rhetoric, and more recently in the wake of the protests and how bad COVID is, you do see Russia and China donating materials, right, to confront the pandemic. So there's this symbolic shows of solidarity. But in terms of really being economic, key economic partners, I don't think the dynamic's there yet. And I don't know if it will go there yet. I mean, I think it has long been the case that governments of socialist states that have moved to market socialism, China, Vietnam, these are countries that have close historic relationships with Cuba, but they have also told the Cuban government, hey, this insistence on slow walking some of this, you need to do something like what we did. The Cubans have resisted that. And so I don't think the economic relationship is particularly close. Vietnam and Cuba, they have pretty robust ties. Vietnam's the major supplier of rice, which is, Cubans eat per capita more than almost anyone on the planet. But again, I don't see a new economic, kingmaker, right, in either case. But it is safe to say that when the United States pulls back, these countries sort of, dial up their ties, and so there is a national interest and security argument that you can make the United States to say, we need to be on the ground in Cuba and have a relationship with the government, even if we have differences of opinion, if only to sort of ward off these other countries. And I'll just say that I think that's really important, because one of the other things that clearly is more important to the Biden administration than it was to Obama, and there's a certain continuity with Trump, is, to the extent that we're moving toward a new Cold War with China, with Russia, et cetera, this kind of strategic calculus. I mean, Cuba's in the middle of that. So yeah, that's my answer.
Mike, I always, from traveling with you, I got the sense that the revolution, I mean, certainly, now, these many decades after it took place, is as much about defending sort of Cuban nationalism from being overwhelmed by the U.S. economy. And if you adapt, if you liberalize your market, who's going to swamp it? And so it's as much about patriotism or nationalism as it is about socialism.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, it's not the same for China to go through market reforms as it is Cuba, an island that's 90 miles from the United States. But on the one hand, but Cuba also can't have their cake and eat it too perennially, right? They talk about the U.S. embargo as the primary obstacle to Cuba's economic development. And as I've argued, it is a huge obstacle. I wouldn't say it's the only thing, but it is an impediment. But if it is, then that means that you want investment. Now, you want investment on certain terms. Until very recently, the terms of foreign investors, most foreign investors in Cuba, could only sort of really be in joint venture partnerships with enterprises of the Cuban state, in which the Cuban state owns 51% and the partner owns 49%. But that wasn't working for a lot of foreign investors, not from the United States. And so they've liberalized foreign investment laws. They've created the Mariel special trade zone where, you can have 100% foreign ownership. So they're moving in that way anyway, right? And so I believe me, I'm a student of Cuban history. I'm a student of Cuban nationalism. I'm a student of U.S. empire and U.S. intervention in Cuba's economy. I don't want either a Cuba that's dominated by the United States. I want Cuba that's controlled and for the benefit of the Cuban people. But I think it was a mistake when the Obama opening happened and you had all this rush of Americans, some of whom didn't know anything about Cuba and were frankly there just to drink a mojito. But nonetheless, very few actual deals were signed. There was a limited possibility to do business because of restrictions in the U.S. embargo. But Obama administration did open some possibilities, and the Cuban government really slow walked it. They did a couple of things, but really they used it just to go to the Europeans and say, hey, we've got the Americans at our doors. Why don't we do business with you first? And again, time caught up with them. They didn't expect Trump to get elected. They thought that U.S. policy had changed, that they could take their time. And at the end of the day, they lost more than they gained, I would say. So I think at a certain point they've got to dive in. And if they are concerned about the effects of foreign investment, regulate it, tax it, create progressive taxation that allows you to sustain a social welfare state, and create the tools and the framework so that Cubans themselves can build businesses from the ground up, right, to compete with or partners themselves with foreign interests, right? Foreign investors have more legal authority in the Cuban economy than Cuban citizens do right now. That doesn't make sense for Cuban nationalism either.
Okay, I'm seeing some familiar faces pop up, and some faces we haven't seen for a while, so it's good to see them here. Anna Logan, you've got a question, and then I'm going to go to my colleague Dave Roberts, who's got a good question as well. So Anna Logan, go ahead first. Hi, Anna.
Hi. I can remember decades ago that the Canadians just loved Cuba. They fell in love with it, and they swarmed there as tourists. And Canada itself was very generous towards Cuba. I wonder what the situation is now between Canada and Cuba.
Yeah, the relationship is still warm and constructive. It's funny. Justin Trudeau, his father, as you may know, was had a pretty close personal relationship with Fidel Castro. There's even this conspiracy that circulates online that Justin Trudeau is actually the child of Fidel Castro. And there is a kind of a striking likeness if you manipulate the photos in a certain way. But that relationship has also been complicated a little bit. Something I haven't mentioned is that in 2016-17, there were also these weird health incidents among U.S. diplomatic personnel that led the Trump administration to then really basically almost close the U.S. embassy for all intents and purposes. But they also impacted Canadian diplomats. A lot of theories as to what it may be or whether it's all made up, but the fact that Canadian diplomats also were affected and did close their embassy for a time, it did put a little bit of a strain in the diplomatic relationship, although it must be said Canada has handled it in a much different way than the United States did. They did not sort of blow up the diplomatic relationship in the way that the Trump administration did. So I think that relationship is still close. There are, my understanding is, some Canadian tourists who have been dribbling into Cuba to the extent that they've opened certain beach resorts for travel even during the pandemic. But yeah, I mean, the pandemic has changed everything. I mean, there's just not those waves of travelers that are on the island right now, and it's unclear when there will be again. Okay,
Dave, let's open your mic because you've got a good question about vaccines, because Cuba does have a vaccine. Go ahead, Dave.
No, thanks for putting me on the spot. Hi, good afternoon. I'm aware of Cuba's prowess in the field of medicine, but I'm fascinated that it's been able to develop its own vaccine. I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about how they've achieved that. But more particularly, I was wondering whether Cuba sees the vaccine as an economic tool, a way to earn hard currency by selling it, or whether Cuba sees it as a tool for building international relationships.
It's all of those things at once, in my estimation. I mentioned Cuba's biotech industry going back to the 1980s. So really at the start of this pandemic, Cuba made a pretty unique choice, certainly in the developing world, which is rather than sign on to things like COVAX, they said, no, we're going to make a bet on developing our own vaccines. And they've, I think they have something like 5 candidates in total. There are 2 in particular that have been, I think, been through phase 3 trials, and the results that have been reported by the state biotech industry are put those vaccines as having comparable effectiveness with, Pfizer, the ones that they're coming from big pharma internationally. So, this was all set to be, if Cuba's own development took longer than, say, what big pharma was able to achieve, this was still set to be a real success story for Cuba because, they had kept the disease pretty well controlled for most of 2020, and then they were going to start bringing their own vaccines online. I mean, the Cuban government rhetoric around this, they were triumphalist to the point of worrying some Cuban scientists and saying, wait a second, like, we're still in phase 3 trials, the results are good, but we can't talk about this as if it's already done, right? Like, let's not put the cart before the horse. What has happened, however, is that is the Delta strain, right? They are now in a situation where the Delta strain appears to be expanding as at the faster or at the same pace that they can roll out vaccines. Because if they have been able to develop vaccines, they also face, because of the broader economic situation, shortages in syringes, in some of the inputs that are required for making the vaccines. So this has created some hurdles in the vaccination campaign, but it is still rolling out. We're not yet seeing the results of it. I forget the percentage of the Cuban population that has been fully vaccinated at this point. The one thing that's complicated is that one of the Cuban vaccines requires 3 doses, not 2, or let alone just 1. So it's a bit of a prolonged process. The other thing that must be said, though, is that because the state kind of banked on this as their way out of this sanitary crisis, that has contributed, again, given the broader economic situation, to shortages in the medical system of all other kinds, right? So now in Cuba, the Cuban state also produces generic medications, typically antibiotics, aspirin, whatever. Can't find any of that, right? It's all in incredibly short supply. And so you have kids that are have an infection and can't find an antibiotic, right? So and then the healthcare system is overwhelmed because of the rise of cases in COVID. So it's a very difficult situation right now. Eventually, though, there is still this potential for a payoff of the kind that you mentioned, of Cuba being able to say to the world, to the developing world in particular, we did it our own way. We did it without big pharma, without this COVAX mechanism that has received some critiques for being, for being an unequal way of distributing vaccines around the world. And we can offer it to you. Iran is signed a deal to manufacture one of the Cuban-made vaccines for their own population, as one example. I think it might be also being manufactured in China. But so they will be able to potentially give some of it away. But let's make no mistake. I mean, healthcare exports have been an important part of the economy as well. And so I think that they are eyeing, some kind of a payoff of being able to offer a vaccine to the developing world at a cheaper price than big pharma. But again, right now the crisis is at home, and they need to get out of a really, really bad moment in terms of COVID at home. And until they do that, I think the other things are kind of sort of fall a little bit into the backdrop, or at least they have at the moment.
Great question, Dave. Thank you very much for that. We are running out of time, and I'm going to take 2 questions together. So Claudia Baker and Ruth Campbell. So go ahead, Ruth first, and then Claudia as well. Go ahead. Ruth, if you haven't got your question there, I'm going to ask it for you.
Yes, sorry. No, I'm just going to unmute myself. Yes. Yeah. I'm interested in whether the internal dissent or uprising is directed towards the personality, like the new president, or is it, or indeed the system, or is it just directed really towards government policy and particularly economic policy?
Okay, great. And then Claudia Baker, you've got a good question about sugarcane, which you can see planted all over Cuba. Go ahead, Claudia.
I believe that the sugar industry suffered very badly when the Russians pulled out. I'm just wondering what the position is now.
Okay, so 2 quite different questions there. So maybe deal with the sugar very briefly, and then let's talk about personalities or the regime and how people are reacting to them.
Yeah, I'll take the sugar one first because it's a short answer. The industry never recovered. It's in the pits. There's talk about converting sugar production into ethanol production, for example. It hasn't happened. Not good. So it's in a very dire state. And it's not really that important to the economy anymore. To Ruth's question, it's really all of the above. I think trying to get one reading out of the protests is difficult because they're complicated. But you certainly heard a lot of vitriol directed at the new head of state. There's been somewhat flippant commentary. Well, Diaz-Canel doesn't have the charisma that a Fidel Castro used to have. That's perhaps in part true. I think it's more about he doesn't have the stature or the name, right? There's not the historic legacy. He's got to get his legitimacy through results, and he objectively was handed a very hard deck of cards. But I think that there have also been some major government fumbles. So he has certainly come in for a lot of vitriol, but the critique also seems to be systemic, and it must be emphasized again. This is not just an economic situation, although that has aggravated it. There are political demands for change. I haven't even talked about this, but over the last 6 months, one of the other things that happened was a very interesting but intense period of conflict between the Cuban state and certain elements of Cuban civil society, particularly artists, right, who were demanding greater expression, demanding political change. This stuff was catching on in a certain sense on social media in a way that it hadn't before, was speaking to at least some younger Cubans. So I think all of these things have kind of, condensed, but, it also must be said, there was a really interesting article that was published in Cuban independent media about this. We also need to think about who was not on the streets, right? Not every Cuban took to the streets on July 11th. Only a minority of Cubans did. In terms of the scale of protests that we might see that we've seen even elsewhere in Latin America over the last year, what happened in Cuba pales in comparison. It's so significant in Cuba because nothing like it has happened in 60 years. But I don't know as if we're at a tipping point, and the government response has certainly made it difficult to think that kind of protest could happen again in the short term. On the other hand, the conditions that drove it are all still there, right? So I don't think that dissent, that frustration is going away at all. And the Cuban government, rather than trying to dismiss the protesters as either paid agents of the enemy or confused, needs to open space for real dialogue with its citizens. And that has been something that it's been remiss to do, and that's not a good thing. So I'll leave it there.
That's a really good point to end it all on. Thank you so much, Mike. It's been a really informative hour. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm hoping that we can get back to Cuba sooner or later with you. But I guess with US restrictions, it's very, very difficult.
We'll see. I still have ways to get there in the current regulatory framework. So we'll see. It's a very difficult time in Cuba. I too look forward to getting back to see friends who I know are having a difficult time. I'm hoping for better days ahead.
Great. Michael Bustamante, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks. Take care.